In this video, we will explain how the loss of dopamine-producing neurons in the brain results in the characteristic manifestation of Parkinson's disease. And I'll preface this by briefly explaining Parkinson's disease for those who aren't familiar with it. So what is Parkinson's disease? Parkinson's disease is a degenerative disorder. It's characterized by resting muscle tremors, increased muscle stiffness, the slowing of voluntary movements, and difficulty maintaining balance. And the disease occurs when dopamine-producing neurons in the part of the basal ganglia that's called the substantia nigra degenerate. The basal ganglia are collections of nerve cells that are located deep in the brain surrounding the thalamus. So if we look at this model here, we can see that this is the putamen, and this is the caudate nucleus. And these are two structures that make up the basal ganglia. The other structures that make up the basal ganglia are located deeper in the model, but we can't see from this angle. And the basal ganglia is directly involved in regulating voluntary muscle movements, as well as it's involved in suppressing involuntary movements and coordinating changes in posture. So we could understand how dysfunction in this specific part of the brain could result in the symptoms that are associated with Parkinson's disease. When the brain initiates an impulse to move a muscle, so like moving your arm, that impulse has to pass through the basal ganglia before being sent to the thalamus and ultimately the motor cortex. The neurons in the basal ganglia release a neurotransmitter that's known as dopamine, and this triggers the next neuron in its pathway to continue that impulse. So we know that Parkinson's disease is caused by a decrease in the amount of dopamine neurons in the basal ganglia, but how exactly does that loss of dopamine neurons cause this? If we look at the figure below, we can see two of the structures in the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra and the striatum. The substantia nigra is the main area that's involved in this disease. So within the substantia nigra are the dopamine neurons. We can draw these here. And these dopamine neurons connect to other neurons in the striatum in order to pass along the impulse for muscle movement. As these neurons start to die, these connections are weakened. And the thalamus is in charge of relaying motor signals to the motor cortex. And then the motor cortex then in turn speaks to the rest of the body, specifically the muscles, to tell them to move. So the job of the basal ganglia is to adjust how active the thalamus can be. If the basal ganglia tells the thalamus to be very active, then it will also increase muscle movement. If the basal ganglia tells the thalamus to decrease its activity, however, it will produce the opposite effect. So this fine-tuned mechanism is important for smoothing motor movement. And if the dopamine neurons are lost, the substantia nigra can't control the activity of the thalamus, and this results in the striatum causing an excessive reduction in the activity in the thalamus. So this is why the loss of dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra cause the slowing down and loss of movement that we see in people with Parkinson's disease.